From the Zimmerman Symphony Center in Canton, Ohio, this is Orchestrating Change. I'm Matthew Jenkins Yarashevitz, Associate Conductor of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Rachel Hegemeyer, President and CEO.
We are so glad you could join us.
This podcast navigates issues that exist in the field of classical music and the world at large. We invite you to listen with open ears as our guests share their experiences and as we discuss these often avoided topics.
Today, we are joined by Leni Boorstin, who spent over 40 years working for the Los Angeles Philharmonic, most recently as Director of Government and Community Affairs. Her tenure included community engagement work surrounding the opening of the Walt Disney Concert Hall and the arrival of music director Gustavo Dudamel, as well as developing the expansive Youth Orchestra LA program from the ground up, a program that now serves over 1,000 young musicians each year. She also served as the Human Relations Commissioner for the City of Los Angeles under 4 different mayors and founded Arts for LA, a nonprofit which advocates for equitable access to the arts across all communities. Leni Boorstin, welcome to Orchestrating Change.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be here and freshen up my thinking about what's happened and what's happening and what's ahead.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, that was an awesome little introduction, but can you just tell us a little bit about you and your background and how you wandered into this field that we call arts management and the orchestra?
I can, I'm going back into ancient history and certainly, but that's more than fine. I want to, Matthew, I want to correct one or two things, which is Yola now has probably almost 2,000 young people involved.
Really?
And
Wow.
I found I was part of a team that founded, I would say, Yola is what I'm much more comfortable saying since nothing is ever done alone.
Of course.
So there you go. Your question, but what got me started? I was very fortunate because when I went to college, it was all open. You could, I went at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, and it was the start of a number of colleges that were lending themselves to having students design their own learning programs. And I went to a school that was being founded my freshman year. I'm in the charter class of Kirkland College. Kirkland College lasted 10 years. It is now an integral or integrated into the Hamilton College, which was the men's college that's been around for a very long time in upstate New York. Kirkland was a coordinate women's college at the time. Pass-fail system, no required classes. It was just very inventive and wonderful. And my major was community and the arts. And I don't know how many people can really speak to the notion that they so specifically kept on a path that started in their college years. But that was in its own way, it's a very tumultuous time, to say the least. And that was a start. I took a senior, I'll try to keep this short, but I took a senior year in San Francisco and started working at the Exploratorium, and again, had a lot of control is the wrong word, but I had a lot of leeway to try to develop a beginning learning path to be able to develop sound and hearing and music exhibits for a science museum. It's very lucky. Frank Oppenheimer, the founder, brother of Robert Oppenheimer, who had been blacklisted for a period of time and taught science in Pagosa Springs. He was a flute player. So we played flute duets together. I worked there, as an intern my senior year in college. And then he said, if you come back to San Francisco, because I grew up in the East, if you come back, you'll have a job. Think how informal that is. That was not a job interview. That was like, if you make it back here, you can have a job. And I did, and he did, and I worked there for 5 years. The arts management then came in because in LA, at UCLA, there was an arts management program. And I always thought, and I say this as a woman, that I wanted a graduate degree because I could imagine that I might leave, take a break from the workforce, getting married, having kids or whatever else, and then I'd come back. And I wanted that graduate degree, and UCLA had an arts management program that was stellar and wonderful. And during that arts management program, also the Coro Foundation, which had a public affairs in the arts part of it for graduate students, as well as for board members and people working in the arts, different segments of it. And that grounded me finally in Los Angeles and on the path to arts management upon graduation from the UCLA program. Before that, when I moved down to LA, I worked at KPFK and had a kind of a noontime radio program and was reading composers' names incorrectly off of record jackets as much as anything, and then working on a kind of contemporary music lunch hour program with a composer named Carl Stone. So everything just added up together, and by the time I graduated, I was working on a conference that was related to arts advocacy, and I was almost going to work in the arts directly and for the arts advocacy organization, but the person who was at the LA Phil way back when in development was leaving, and we had a development department of 2, and I applied for the job, and that's how I started there.
It is hard to believe that the biggest budget orchestra in the US ever had a development department of 2, but that is remarkable.
It is a crazy time. Yeah, and it gets a little crazier, but at the Music Center in Los Angeles at that point was the there was a unified fund for all the resident companies of the Music Center. So that included LA Opera, wasn't founded quite yet, but Center Theater Group and the Master Chorale. There was the civic pride in building the Music Center was so strong that there were many community civic leaders who were as involved in just the civic pride of having a music center in downtown LA as they were in the particular art form. And then as things matured in downtown LA, people started to realize that they had individual passions. And so eventually the Unified Fund broke apart. But when I started working, it was in place. And so all that the LA Phil needed was a grant writer, essentially, in their development department.
Wow.
And this was before computers. And I had an assistant who had an IBM Selectric. And so you had to kind of retype into the little boxes for the National Endowment for the Arts and the California Arts Council and such. And that's what we did.
Wow.
So I hope that gave you a path.
Oh, yeah. That does. Very
That's
much
at least how it all got started. And I want to comment, I'm a graduate of Brown University, where I was a part of the open curriculum, and hearing you talk about your college experience, I was like, wow, this woman had a very similar experience to me. Mine was not quite as free in a lot of ways. I only took a few classes pass fail. And I did do the music major, that's sort of their standard music major, but it took me back hearing you talk about your own experience.
Well, I should say there was a conflict because Kirkland had evaluations, pass fail or whatever, but Hamilton did not. And the music classes were at Hamilton, the philosophy classes, whatever else. So it was a little bit of split. But then to see all that have to turn into grades anyway on a transcript to get into, business school was amusing in and of itself. I never saw that transcript, actually. I have no idea what it said, but it worked.
Yeah. So you started in development at a time where basically the whole job was writing grants. You weren't courting individual donors at the time.
No.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying I had a chip on my shoulder about all of that because growing up you're touching a chord in some way. Growing up East, my sense was people, and it's not necessarily accurate, that people gave money in the things they believed in, and for altruistic reasons. It wasn't transactional. But by the time coming to LA, it felt as though there was a different ethos, and I didn't understand it very well, of individual giving, which is that there's some transaction as a part of it. There was generosity, but it also came with perks, which I didn't quite understand that exchange. And perhaps it was something in my parents' life that I just didn't see, but I came pure of heart. So I was very grateful that I wasn't responsible for individual donors in that first. It was it was more policy. I was on the advocacy side in those early days. Ernest Fleischman was very committed to, public policy that supported the arts. So early on, I was involved in advocacy for the pots of money that in turn would support the arts. At that point, somewhere early on, President Reagan was going to do away with the NEA, for instance. So there was a rally across the arts community, of course, to help that not happen. So that was a piece of my work early on, to advocate for the pots of money from which I was also then writing grant applications.
Okay.
Yeah.
So ultimately, you ended up in community engagement. How did you shift from development into this sector?
Well, first of all, I'd say that what I loved about doing the work for, we're applying for grants to a few foundations, but mostly to the levels of government, local and state and federal. The kinds of things that public policy, the public sector, the government sector wanted to fund were education and community programs. So pretty early on, I got involved with developing the programs that then we would apply for funds to support. And also what was happening in LA by that time, or around 1982, 84, whatever it was. And yes, I know you weren't born then. The Los Angeles hosted the Olympics, and there was a huge, wonderful arts component to the Olympic art. There was an Olympic Arts Festival. And after the Olympic Arts Festival, there was an LA Arts Festival that was supported in LA. And Peter Sellers was involved in that. And Peter Sellers was an advisor to the LA Phil artistically. And one of the things he did right within the Arts Festival, in which the LA Phil sort of picked up on, was decentralizing the arts. Peter recognized that all through LA County, there were artists. There were artists who had come from Cambodia and were, living in Long Beach. There were, I don't quite have the word, but they're artists in other art forms other than Western classical art forms that were scattered throughout LA. And he decentralized the arts festival and didn't put it all downtown in the big box sort of places where art happened previously. He made sure it was distributed and supported and recognized throughout the county. And at the same time, that is when the LA Phil started what we called neighborhood concerts, which was to bring the Philharmonic as an orchestra into communities throughout LA. And that was something that I was responsible for at the time. Did that answer that question?
Yeah,
One question by the time I get
yeah,
to
well, it's so interesting to me because I feel like anytime I talk to community engagement professionals, community engagement is so integral, or such a part of every other department of what's going on, because it's kind of just what the orchestra, what the entity is, and development is tied to it, and marketing is tied to it, and artistic operations, everything is tied to it. And of course, now for the majority, it is community engagement, which is the term that is used in the field when we're talking about going into communities and creating partnerships and all these different things. But I feel like for a long time, the term used often was outreach. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about going away from the term outreach and leaning more into the idea of community engagement, and how those two things are different, and why community engagement is maybe the more preferred term and way of thinking now.
I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm also wondering, is the terminology going to change again? I don't know how, because terminology evolves in some way, but outreach so much what is defined as, in my mind, is a one-way street. It's going, I have something, it's good, and you don't have it, and I want to give it to you. And that's what outreach is. It's not asking, it's not it's not having a conversation. It's saying, I got something good, and I'm going to just give it to you, and it's good for you. So and I'm doing good and I'm going to feel good because I'm creating accessibility for something. Access was is still a viable word, and that's connected to outreach, one could say, but the one-way street of outreach is what we all find as unacceptable, and where engagement came into play. What was fun for me around the neighborhood concerts is that, where they came from to begin with was big events that happened in LA. There was earthquakes. So the first thing that, Ernest Fleisch wanted to do was, oh, there's an earthquake, we need some healing concerts. Oh, there are the LA riots, we need some healing concerts. But, how can we participate in this civic event? How can this community-wide occurrence? He did not want the orchestra to stand on the sidelines of it. And we started the neighborhood concerts before the civic unrest of the in Los Angeles around Rodney King and all that had happened after the determination that there was no fault in the police at that point. And the only reason we could have concerts in different communities, in this case, the Black and Korean community where there was conflict, was because we'd already been in conversations in different communities, often using, one of the first places we went for those connections was through churches. But we'd already started to have those conversations. We weren't coming in from nowhere. But even earlier than that, with Zubin Mehta and Calvin Simmons, a generation before, the LA Phil was known to do concerts in churches and with community choirs. Zubin Mehta led those, and they were when I came to the Philharmonic. I forgot, Joe Moreland was on board, and he had started with Ernest something called originally called the Minority Musicians Training Program, which changed and morphed in itself. But there were different ways of engaging that the Philharmonic already had the threads of and was prepared to evolve with the changing times too. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think this is remarkable because the podcast was started in 2020, in large part as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement surrounding the death of George Floyd. But we look at those of us in the orchestra world, once we all sort of became aware of all of the issues that we were having surrounding engaging with our whole communities that we were a part of. We look at the LA Phil, and you guys have been doing it for a long time. Mm-hmm. Do you know, it sounds like even before you were there, these efforts were being made. Is that the case?
Without a doubt. Calvin Simmons was the assistant, I guess, or associate conductor at the time. African-American, he died young in an accident, but he and Zubin were doing, concerts both in prisons and through churches, and had a great reputation, created great relationship for having been doing those concerts. The problem was, the problematic part was they did a set of concerts over a period of time and developed those relationships. Joe Westmoreland was a a human who was still engaged in this work with the Philharmonic. He was a music director of a prominent Black church in LA, also, as well as working at the Philharmonic. But in between, by the time I got there in 1980, those concerts had stopped for 10 years. The concerts in neighborhoods, in the churches, and with choirs and with gospel choirs, they'd stopped for a period of time. So the other reputation that an orchestra has is that it starts things and it stops things, and that's a tough lesson to embrace for all of us. And one of the things I noticed also in the early days of the work that I was doing is the Chicago Symphony had an amazing array of community and education programs. Probably things were still being talked about as outreach, but they were doing things that were really embedded. They felt embedded at the time into community settings, both concerts and music learning and whatever else. I can't remember the specific nature of them. They were there. They were the envy, of the work. You kind of, wow, that's so good. And then the funding stopped, and the programs went away. And that was a huge lesson too. That was again, you only do it. You don't stop your orchestra. The orchestra is still playing. You still have your subscription concerts, but it was an odd lesson to me that in an orchestra, of course the orchestra and the concerts and the subscription series and whatever else is a tight core, but to see everything else expendable around it is a problem for orchestras, because everybody gets feeling periodically abandoned. And that does not work well as a something, in someone's body for community engagement.
Yeah.
You did something, we did something together, we're not doing it anymore, you don't have the money for it, we're not doing it again, I've asked you to do something else, could you come back, whatever else. You say, no, I don't have the money, goodbye, I can't do it. And then there's a break in the continuity and the relationship building and trust.
Yeah, we've had this conversation. There's been a few people on the podcast that we've talked to that, Eric Gould is the first one that comes to mind, who we talk and he goes, Rachel, in 1980, I was at a panel with a bunch of Black composers about how do we make things more diverse. And, we had that conversation, and then it went away. And then in the early 2000s, I was at another panel and I was with a bunch of, and so it's this cyclical nature. So we've talked about that a lot, about the cyclical nature of it, but I don't think no one's ever talked about how the scary nature of the fact that all of our other programs, right, that all of the community engagement programs, the educational programs are entirely like grant funded, or, it's almost entirely grant funded. And it's very rare that those programs are built into the budget as budget line items that are not dependent upon when funding will come in. And it's scary as a professional working in that space to think, if we don't get these funds, it's gone. And I can't, I'm going to be told it can't happen because we don't have the money for it. And so I think, I don't know the answer to the question I'm posing now of how do we make them, why do we, the next question was why is community engagement important? Why should we care? But I think maybe it's how do we make community engagement actually more embedded in what we're doing as organizations, so it's not as easily expendable from a financial standpoint.
It is a challenge for sure. And again, the LA Phil is I will call it in this case a privileged place because of its overall business model that, if nothing else, includes the Hollywood Bowl. And so that means and I don't know if the Canton Orchestra is year round or is, per service, or what the contract looks like.
We're per service, union per service, or group 5 in the League of American Orchestras.
Budget ranking
1 through 8, tiers 1 through 8. We're group 5, and we do only generally perform September through May.
But we do have a summer program, again funded by grants, that happens in the parks in the summer.
But even that, to your point, we used to have a full orchestra concert in the park and on Labor Day weekend. And there wasn't funding for that this year. So I was very bummed because I really enjoyed conducting it. And unfortunately, we're not doing it anymore.
Right. And so the problem is here, I don't have the answers. I recognize, but I in the path of the LA Phil, I recognized its unique position, which is that with the summer, means that's 3 months a year, in the orchestra is, it is employed annually for throughout the whole year. The 3 months of not losing money. I mean, an orchestra, it is creating, the bowl season creates excess revenue over expense since it seats 18,000, and we present not just orchestra concerts that may have 6 or 8 or 11 or 12,000 people on rare occasion, but other kinds of music also that then go into the overall, revenue for the Philharmonic. That means that it has, it has, I mean, I think we have the highest percentage of earned, I still say we, 2.5, almost 3 years retired, more earned revenue than most orchestras because of that unusual business model. That makes sense. Yeah. Or business reality because of the bowl.
Yeah. So I think that's something to think, I used to be manager of education community engagement. Now I'm president and CEO. So I used to see just the education budget, right? I used to just see my budget and see how that works. And now I'm looking at the full budget and going, oh, crap, how do orchestras do this when for so many orchestras, the model that we have is the cost to put on a concert versus how much we sell in tickets is just not there, right? So we're losing money on classical concerts. So how do we find our ways into spaces where we're creating enough, revenue, and we're creating enough stable forces of revenue that we don't have to worry, if it goes away, we're, out of luck. How do we get to that space so that we can have more stable engagement programming? And so that's a big question on my mind that I don't have an answer to, and maybe one day someone will, and it'll be great.
Well, in my mind, I hope you have a very, very supportive board, an enlightened board, and a board that's not only interested in the orchestra, but is also interested in other civic, other civically minded aspects of your city and county that they're engaged in some way, or that you've also developed more board members who have a broader sense beyond just the orchestra, who can be kind of more supportive and help deepen connections in other parts of this, the fabric of Canton, that help the orchestra be seen slightly differently. Because I think orchestras, we all exist in a bubble, and breaking through the bubble is not an easy thing to do. In the end, we are somewhere where we are a bubble unto ourselves. We are our own echo chamber, I guess, is what I'm saying somehow.
Yeah, pretty much so.
So I don't know whether there are other bonds that you have in Canton with education and arts education, and how that thread works, or the arts community as a whole that is also, whatever you're struggling in terms of resources, the rest of the arts community is also struggling. Yeah, exactly. So the question I have is how working together, every working together can accomplish more than working on one's own.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'd like to, you've used the word civic a lot in this conversation. And I don't think it's a term, you worked in kind of the governmental and the civic space as well, but what is this idea of civic mindedness? What should orchestras be thinking about when it comes to civic responsibility and being civically minded beyond just being our own organizations? Because I don't think I've heard people use the term civic when talking about an orchestra's responsibilities.
Well, I again, let me say that it comes for the LA Phil, it comes from a very specific place, because at the Music Center, we're in a county-owned building, a county-owned facility. We have a lease with the county to produce concerts. In order for the county to make revenues off the parking lot underneath the concert hall, there need to be events, not just people parking for jury duty. So we automatically have, we're in public land, not to mention, land that is, first peoples who live there and all that, that implies. But also the Hollywood Bowl. The Hollywood Bowl is a county park. Our lease is not actually through the music center and the county as it is down for the winter season. It is with our lease is with the county parks department. So we can't afford, we need to be, in my mind, that's how I'm using civic engagement. So we need to be engaged. We have a relationship, we have a contract that we have, we have a contract, a lease, and they have expectations and we have expectations, and we need to deliver on them on both sides of it. The first, but that grew up naturally. I mean, the LA Phil, or an orchestra with a different name, but essentially the LA Phil, and then, 100 years ago or whatever, was playing for the Easter Sunrise service and playing in the Dell, which is what became the Hollywood Bowl when it was then constructed in different ways. And I can't remember all the calendar years of it, but let's say it started in 1920 or so. And then there was a merger of different organizations. Always, though, the land was given to the county initially for the Easter Sunrise service and for some concerts. And the first lease, what happened to, and it was Ernest Fleischman at the time, and was the CEO or the executive director. Titles of everything. I can't remember everybody's title anymore. The first lease was that the Hollywood Bowl was leased to the LA Phil for $1 a year.
Wow.
But that was because it was an underperforming county asset. It was, I don't know if you know the term white elephant, but it was sitting there and not enough was happening. So they leased it to the Philharmonic for 30 years at $1 a year, with the expectation of a couple things, that all of revenues from parking lots would go to the county. And the county maintained the park aspect of the Hollywood Bowl. And then the Philharmonic would put on concerts, and the Philharmonic then expanded, concerts from 2 nights a week to 3 nights a week to 4, 5, 6 nights a week over time. So by the time of the second lease, it was, oh, no, it's not $1 a year. The second lease, which is an amazing sort of thing, but I say it with great respect to say that this is why the LA Phil uniquely can't separate itself from being civically engaged. You have you have county supervisors who also, represent the bowl specifically and understand the Hollywood Bowl is on the county seal. Is what I'm also originally with a cross for the Easter Sunrise, which at some point was taken off, but the Hollywood Bowl is on the seal for the county. So it has been seen for more than a century as an important asset to Los Angeles, and the LA Phil is the steward of it. The second lease was such that the Philharmonic, from revenues from putting on concerts, would give back to the county enough that the county could run the park, pay for the park on an annual basis. So there's no taxpayer money going to run the park on an annual basis because of the activity of the LA Phil at the bowl. That's a very unusual situation, it's to say the least. And I think the next lease could also have some changes, because that people understand that while we look at our budget on an annualized basis, that there are a lot of resources, a lot of money is generated putting on these concerts successfully at the Hollywood Bowl. I can go on. The county also then, asked the Philharmonic to, in the last few years, the Ford Theater, which is a small theater where there's a passion play that was produced there for 100 years, across the street from where the Hollywood Bowl is. So we now have a big venue there, the LA Phil, and then across the street, there's the Ford Theater, which puts on small, more intimate, but which gives the Philharmonic a way, again, of using its expertise to produce and present a whole, with a whole different mission on behalf of the county and people of Los Angeles. But at the Ford Theater, the presentations tend to be more local and represent artists and artistry from all different kinds of music and performing arts forms well beyond what an orchestra does.
Wow. So along the lines of being civically engaged, you were the Human Relations Commissioner for the city of Los Angeles. In addition to what you did with the LA Phil, I assume. So tell us a little bit about that. You worked under 4 different mayors.
Well, to say that I worked there's, the staff that's attached to a commission. And so then we are, a set of people that sit there and go and twiddle our thumbs or, listen to presentations about issues of surveillance or LGBT. And then, when I started, Q was not a part of that. Things evolved. And then, police relations with communities, that those were kind of issues that came, and there was a lot of study and acknowledgement of anniversaries related to LA civil disturbance. I sat on it because that's something that we in the arts wanted to begin to think about doing, is be involved in other parts of the civic life of our communities. And so that just came through at having a network of people that I knew, and someone said, why don't you do this? I think it came from, I felt as though I had a good overview for the city and county of LA coming from the neighborhood concerts. When you produce concerts and you're always, I don't know how, COVID is a whole other thing that, is heartbreaking, because I don't know how you do this work well or in this way in COVID, because if my initial way of engaging is to show up in other people's communities, at other people's meetings, with other people's agendas, with other people's priorities. Zoom does not do it, and in any way, shape, or form, or it's not a vocabulary that I felt I could ever have been successful in. So COVID and my retirement kind of coincided, which I in some way was grateful for, because I don't know how you doing engagement work under COVID is more challenging in my mind.
How do you think doing that human relations work with the city informed then what you were doing with the orchestra?
Was it not as deeply as you would like to think, or ideally as I would like to think, or whatever else. I met some wonderful humans, and then so it's just a network of people who are involved in different things. So it, at some point when, let's say, one of our YOLA students actually needed a particular kind of lawyer related to something, there was a lawyer who was on the Human Relations Commission, that you kind of make connections that way. But in terms of the relation, I would say it was more personal and internal than how I could directly benefit or link the Philharmonic and the work of the Human Relations Commission. It was too diffuse and it didn't work that way well.
Got it. Well, let's talk about something now that is near and dear to my heart, and you brought it up, so let's go for it. Youth Orchestra LA, now serving almost 2,000 students. Part of my role here at the Canton Symphony Orchestra is I am the music director of our Youth Symphonies program, which has been around, I believe, since 1961 here. It's a long running, and well, Canton is a lot smaller than LA. We have about just under 100 in our program, but we are nonetheless proud of it. So I'm curious, how did YOLA get started, and what was your involvement? You said that you worked with a whole team of people. It wasn't just you yourself, but tell us a little bit about this program, how it got started, and how you were involved.
I will do, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I mentioned this, like, we get LA back to back in this season, because next episode is with some people from YOLA. So I'm really excited that we're talking with you to get the origin story. And then we can talk with them who are currently working with Camille. And I think a current student is going to join to talk about it. So I'm very interested in this answer, because it's going to help us out a lot for the next conversation we're going to have.
Great. Well, first of all, that she wants to have a student is indicative of a direction that Yola has evolved into after, it started in 2007, which is giving student voice. Again, you think of engagement with the way we talked about one-way or two-way street or an outreach or whatever else, but in this case, it's empowering students to have voice themselves in relation to what happens. Because I'm sure, and I'm jumping into the middle of something here, Matthew, but I imagine as any orchestra, and there are times when you bring your students into a board situation or whatever else, and they perform for the board, and they may sit at a table at a lunch or a dinner afterwards, and the board peppers them with questions. But on rare occasion, are the students comfortable enough or feeling they're given permission enough to actually ask the board questions, and to kind of ask what they because they're curious. They want to know how board got into their positions of influence and what their pathway was. And rarely in those circumstances has that element been designed or emphasized or whatever into how the event goes. So to me, that Camille wanted to have a student there is really key, really important, and shows where the evolution of Yola. The LA Phil, in its earlier days, did have youth orchestras attached. The Young Musicians Foundation and another orchestra. There were two big major youth orchestras, and they had a connection to the LA Phil. Then they were spun off independently as their own 501c3s. Before my time, which is, beginning in 1980, so it was even before that. And as in Canton or San Francisco, it is not it's less uncommon if an orchestra is going to have a youth orchestra. You're taking, I assume, the best players that you find in amongst young people in your community, which is admirable and great and works as it should, and as a wonderful thing in a community. What the LA Phil was able to do, because there are a lot of youth orchestras in LA, not just one, but like 17, 18 or a zillion of them. And they are, in some cases, paid. I don't know what the circumstances are with yours, but the musicians often, the young musicians, the families pay to be a part of it.
That's exactly what we do. Yes.
Right. And I'm not making, I'm saying this without judgment, but I'm saying that the Philharmonic had the position, the privilege again, the circumstances to be able to turn that model on its head. And yes, it came from the, impending or the desired arrival of Gustavo Dudamel as our music director, knowing that El Sistema was so important to him, and how El Sistema was serving young people across Venezuela, and it was a program for people who did not otherwise have the resources. And in the schools in Venezuela, another piece of it is they ended at noon. So in a certain way, that their after school music programs 5 days a week were connected to the need for childcare, right? You have working parents, your school day ends at noon, you have no money, you have limited financial resources. What do you do with your kids? And this is something that got developed, again, out of public policy. I mean, Dr. Abreu came from the health department, not from education, not from arts, not from culture. It was the health department. He got the funding to build healthier communities initially, which is kind of mind-boggling. All right, so cut to LA, and the LA Phil decided that what El Sistema was, and what Gustavo was intrigued by, was something the Philharmonic should get involved in, should start. And so with the then education director, and my job at that point was to understand the lay of the land to a certain extent, and to see if there were partners from education and from nonprofit organizations with whom we could work to establish. There was no name or a different name before Yola, but I can't remember what it was, to start a an ongoing program in some where we could bring kids in to learn instruments and to begin with, and to model a program like El Sistema. And that started in 2007, but we also banded together, knowing this is the civic part in a different way, going back to your previous question, knowing that the Simone Bolivar Orchestra was going to be coming to Los Angeles to perform in Walt Disney Concert Hall in 2007. The CBS 60 Minutes program had already aired. There's a lot of attention and interest in this. We knew that the light would be shined on music orchestras, music learning, on all of this, and we were very cognizant that it should not all fall to the LA Phil. All that light would be wasted if it just shone on the LA Phil. So before they arrived, we gathered together all, for almost a year, it felt like all of the players in the nonprofit music world who were engaged in youth music learning, to see what we could, begin to accomplish together, or what we could expand, what we could learn about, so that it wasn't about the Philharmonic, it was about the whole music learning community. And a number of programs came out of that and were strengthened by it. And everyone, there's a photo from that time when, a lot of, Deborah Border was then the music director, the CEO, and, all of the different people, about 30, 40 people from the arts community, the music arts community, were on stage kind of welcoming, and, the Simone Bolivars there, and to begin to get a sense of what we could all learn from what their model was, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I've been lucky enough to visit the new facility in Inglewood, because that was part of the pre-day for the LEAD conference last year, and it was so wonderful and beautiful, and such a nice space. And correct me if I'm wrong, Yola, to me, it's based in the Inglewood neighborhood. And is it really a neighborhood program, or do students come from all over LA, or is it mostly students who are busing distance, walking distance, driving distance, kind of, because it's 2,000 students, which is a lot of kids, right? So
wait,
yeah.
When I say we started in 2007, I mean, the Yola Center is a center. There is a local program for Inglewood, and within 3, 4, 5. It doesn't need to be the 5-mile radius, but around Inglewood. But that's the fifth program. There are 4 other program sites.
Yes.
Right?
There's the Inglewood one, and what are the other sites?
Now, you're taxing my age.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, but the first one's the Expo Center. The first one was Expo Center.
Okay.
The second one was Heart of LA, which is in the MacArthur Park area of LA, and has a community center focus. We started with community centers rather than schools. The third one originally was located at the LA County High School for the Arts, because the county supervisor very much wanted to make sure there was a program in our district, because the kids, I'm talking fast now, the kids who went to the LA County High School for the Arts by audition or whatever, they were kids to come from all over the county, but in music, they were not coming from her district, from the first district. They did not have the training that kids from other parts of the county, wealthier parts of the county, public or private schools, could come into this wonderful countywide art school. And she said, whoa, you've got a YOLA program in South LA, and you've got one in around MacArthur Park, which is not too far from, it's east of downtown, and in a Central American and Korean neighborhood, where more people walk as opposed to drive. That's really, kids came from very close by. What are you doing for me in East LA is basically what she was saying, which is where Cal State LA is and where the High School for the Arts is. And so we started, with the principal and with a joint venture agreement with Everett, we started a program on the campus of Cal State LA, which is where the LA County High School for the Arts building is, in their after school hours that were underutilized at that point. I won't go into the whole journey of that, but that program had to move a couple times, but still to serve the first district.
Yeah.
So that's the program. It's now at Taurus High School, Public Arts High School. Another we also wanted, knowing how kids feed one, I don't know how it is in Canton, but do kids go in the public schools, go to one elementary school feed, to one middle school feed, to one high school?
There are a lot of
elementary schools, less middle schools, one high
and
school.
well, really two high schools,
Kind
because
of.
early college are at a
Kind of,
different
yeah,
building.
Two-
Yeah,
Yeah.
but they compete in sports under the same team as the same
Team.
Oh, interesting.
one school.
One
Yeah, even though
campus.
they're these two different campuses that
Yeah.
are serving two
Technically
different student
three
populations.
campuses.
Oh, where's
There's
the
McKinley
third?
downtown.
Oh, yeah,
There's
that's
three
right.
campuses. So.
But Matthew, can you tell where the stronger music programs are by where kids come, where
Yeah.
kids are auditioning?
Yeah, your
Yes.
point of the school for the arts being there and then none of the kids showing up for music from that district. Our youth symphony, the students who are part of our youth, we're directly next to Canton City Schools, right? So our building is a part of the Canton City School District. And the representation of the number of students from Canton City Schools in the youth symphony has gotten better, but it was by no means a good percentage, maybe one or two.
Well, and I'll say further than that there is participation from the Canton City Schools, but almost never in our top orchestra. The top orchestra is kids from the suburbs.
Yeah.
The intermediate and beginner orchestra, there's a lot more kids from the city.
Mhm. So yeah, what you said there really struck me as ringing true for us here.
Well, because LA is so huge, 4 million people in the city and 9 or 10 million in the county. And with lots of youth orchestras, it gave the Philharmonic the ability to turn the model upside down and we had board members who were very committed to us establishing this program. And you don't start with an orchestra when you're starting kids, in our case, where they were 6 and 7 years old. And the program was to give kids free instruments and free lessons. I mean, and that the kids would be in the program 3 or 4 days a week, or 5, almost 5 days a week plus Saturday. Not in every case, and certainly not when they were beginning, but it was a multiple day and weekend commitment. And we partnered first off with a wonderful nonprofit in LA, still very strong today, Harmony Project, that was doing what we couldn't do quite, because they already had teaching artists and they were already teaching young kids and they were already providing free instruments themselves. We partnered with them so that we could expand together. And in this community center where they opened the door, but our affiliation with it really excited the Rec and Parks Department of the city of LA to allow a big orchestra music learning program to be in a recreation and sports oriented center. And we went there because the community center also had its own board. So they were developing resources beyond the city resources for the park. And that's where the first YOLA program started and grew and had 300 to 400 students as part of it. And so, some of the person, it's very possible that one of the people that you're dealing with at YOLA in the Inglewood Center is someone who is a graduate of the program.
Yeah.
Right. So that's, Diana has 2 other sisters who also are graduates of the program. And it's what the board members helped us with in the starting of that was, if we're going to start it, we're never going to abandon it. Because in our initial model for it, thinking again of that early funding crunch of, orchestra start something and then they're likely to, run out of funding, taste change, whatever else. The board member said, who actually it's Tom Beckman, whose name is on the, who was off the board for a while and came back. If the Philharmonic starts something and the original business plan, we'll partner with Harmony Project for, 5 years, and we'll give them, this is the financial commitment and instruments and conductor and this and that we will be responsible for, and they'll teach lessons, and we will work with them for 5 years, help them build up their capacity, raise money, and then we'll slowly move out and start another center. We thought we'd do a serial sort of thing of working with a community partner, help develop their strength, and then slowly move on to another. And the board member said, once you start something, there's no community organization as strong as the symphony. And once the LA Phil starts something, it cannot afford to have it fail in any way. And so the Philharmonic needs to be ongoing, the 51% participant manager, key manager of the program, no matter who we partnered with.
Yeah.
So what we didn't know when we started, Matthew, though, is since there were so many other youth orchestras, what would happen when kids went into middle school or when they went into high school? Would they want to join one of the other youth orchestras? But what we found, and this is interesting to me about community, was that the students, the young musicians, were very connected to one another. And the sense of community was so strong that and we had two orchestras at the time, a more advanced orchestra and a less advanced orchestra within the model of what we were putting into Expo Center, which was a surprise to their founder, because I said, you have an orchestra, why do you need two? What are you talking? We can't give you that much space. But the community of students, their support of one another was so strong, they didn't want to go anywhere else, largely. And some stayed, they were older, but they stayed in the middle orchestra because it was community. And then some were moved to more advanced, and there were ways, as we had more sites, then we had our own more advanced orchestra, and we did orchestras did a tour, an orchestra did a tour of California, which was, fun and exceptional in its own way. So there's a lot, I don't know, that's a lot. I'm throwing a lot at you at the same time.
No, I think it's fantastic. It is so interesting and so different from what we do, and so amazing that Yola has found such a niche in the LA community, in a place where there are so many youth orchestras, and it really, I think it's incredible. So thank you for
wonderful.
sharing.
It's been wonderful and inspiring for sure, and working with the communities and parents has been quite wonderful. It's been remarkable. You'll hear more about it from Camille and whomever the student is, and Camille will bring the experience to you from Baltimore, which is a whole different experience that she brought into what would be, the leadership of Yola. She is the overall director of a manager of Yola, and not only the Beckman Yola Center, but the LA Phil, Yola is not an attachment out here. It is smack in the heart of.
Yeah.
And so, when the LA Phil tours, there's of late, prior COVID, but still Imagine Beyond, and we still did pull everybody together this past summer for the summer national programs. Yola, an ensemble, an orchestra from Yola has been part of the LA Phil international tours, which is also kind of a remarkable thing.
Yeah. I just love that in LA, it is like, people have described it as like the beating heart of the orchestra now. And it's like, it is that we talk about the subscription core stuff, like it's core, it's part of that core, which is just so unique. And I know we're getting towards the end of our time, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing, now that I'm putting retired in quotes because you still do so much. You still do so much and show up to so many things. But now that you've, in quotes, finished your career, looking back, are there moments that you really remember, or what was maybe a through line for you that kept you motivated and doing this work that is hard and tries to be cyclical, but you got to try to keep it from not being? And is there something for you that kind of kept you going as you did this really important work?
There's a couple things to say. One, I think I have the chemical, natural makeup to stay in one place. A lot of people do not have that. I mean, it's, we all have different amounts of whatever, or tendencies towards being optimistic, pessimistic, depressed, not depressed. I'm just have whatever my chemical makeup, I've been able to stay at the Philharmonic and let that be a place that changes under my feet. I've learned to surf. Working for different executive directors was an adjustment each time. But each time there was a carrot, I mean, if I started in development, but I mean, in the fundraising, but doing the neighborhood concerts and having a way to be grounded in LA, which is so big and unwieldy, but I got to know different neighborhood communities because I had an intentionality about it. That kept me going for a while. The building of Walt Disney Concert Hall, which is about to be 20 years old, so it's kind of crazy, was a key driver. It's like, whoa, how can you leave before there's Walt Disney Concert Hall built? And then the transition from Esapeka to Gustavo Dudamel was monumental. Esapeka is the best and most wonderful human ever, and just I've been able to work at the Philharmonic when it was kind of on a steady path like this. It just kept growing and changing and evolving, and I had the privilege, I don't know if I'm misusing that word or not, but to be able to kind of work through it all. Also, as you get older, I had the privilege of working with younger people all the time. I mean, I'm close with my kids, that don't get me wrong, but it is really wonderful to have working relationships with people of different generations, and that kept me going too, in some way. So it's been good. I was lucky.
Yeah.
Well, before we let you go, we're going to ask the question that we ask every guest at the end of every podcast episode. And it's very open-ended, so answer how you will. How do we orchestrate change?
Well, I think I saw it in some way that you already, you are in that space. What I'm hearing, when I heard Rachel say earlier, what warmed my heart, which is you're working together. You're not working isolated from one another, right? Orchestra, I know that's been a cultural way of being that the Philharmonic had to overcome periodically, which is marketing worked in marketing, and artistic worked in artistic, and education worked in education, and then musicians were over here or whatever. But the not working in isolation and kind of across silos is one way to be able to move, different priorities and kind of progress to places that you want to be. That's one way to orchestrate change, and the other is to listen, be in spaces where you can listen to other voices outside the bubble somewhere.
Yeah, I always think that the more we can work together and listen to each other, there's always going to be someone smarter than me. There's always going to be someone with a different idea than me. There's always someone who can add so much value to what you've got. You just have to ask. And so you've been such a kind of beacon of that kind of in the community engagement community. You have no idea how many people, when I first started working, were like, Leni Boorstin, that your name just gets said so often because you are that listener who you find the space and then you sit and you listen and you make these connections. And I just want to tell you how much we all appreciate you and how much it means that you came and talked with us today. It means a lot.
That's so kind. Thank you so much. Well, it's my pleasure. It's great. I've kind of been in a place of not thinking, not being as active this, but you've got me on a day where later in the day we'll be doing some interviews for the, for the fellowship program that started, that's just getting off the ground since my retirement, which I'm thrilled about too, because it's again looking at the next generation of who's going to be. These people love, the arts and whatever, and creating access points for everybody is really exciting for me.
Well, Leni Boorstin, thank you so much for joining us today on our podcast.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much, Rachel, for reaching out. And can I say reaching out? Yes, for engaging me in this. How's that? And I'm so glad that you're talking to Camille and a student next week. That makes me very happy too. It's great.
Leni Boorstin, formerly Director of Government and Community Affairs, and many other things before that at the LA Phil.
Orchestrating Change is a production of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
Our theme music was composed by Eric Gould and performed by Derek Snyder and Tim Adams.
Our audio engineer is Nathan Maslick.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.